I just wanted to record a short video to go with this paper because I think it's really important to give a bit of context behind it and hopefully help people understand where it's come from and why we've set about doing this. Um, as you can see, we've tried to produce a framework that supports data-informed practice and research in high-performance sport. Um, it's been quite a long time in the making, and you can see plenty of different people from a range of sports industry and academic organizations that have contributed to this over more than a couple of years now that we've been working on this. Um, I want to start with kind of why we're doing this. Why did we set out on it, and why are we still kind of working on this? Um, Ultimately, we reflected on lots of our sort of ongoing and past projects that we've done in our sport analytics group here in Swansea. And although we've produced what we feel is kind of lots of good outputs that have benefited lots of the partners we work with, on reflection, none of them kind of reached the full potential that we thought they might at the outset. Um, but that was for many different reasons. And we started to feel that we needed a sort of common framework against which to map these projects at the outset and identify where we might need to kind of fill certain gaps or bring new people in, and also to evaluate those projects as they kind of carried on and continued through their progress. So that was one of the reasons we really put it together, and we think it's hopefully a valuable resource for others to benefit from as well. But the challenge was those projects didn't kind of reach their potential for many different reasons. Um, Probably the most common one is that old adage of kind of garbage in, garbage out. And in many instances, what we were finding on some of these projects was there just wasn't as much good data as we first thought there was, as and when you started to really get into it and pick the data apart. Um, that was for lots of different reasons. Poor quality of existing data. It was incomplete, it was inconsistent, invalid, noisy. There were questions around access, ownership, how it was shared, stored, etc. But ultimately, we were kind of ending up with less data than we thought on lots of these projects. The second one then was the sort of the balance, if you like, between these different approaches and ways of modeling the data. And there are lots of complex ways in which the data can be modeled in an attempt to address the questions that ultimately the sports are asking. But the important thing that hopefully this represents is finding that balance between really complex models that are ultimately hard to interpret and or to apply back into practice versus kind of overly simplistic models or models that fundamentally violate assumptions and we shouldn't be applying in this context. So that kind of balance to find the most parsimonious model that would give us valuable but actionable insight to inform those questions. And again, a real challenge, I think, to reach that point. And then the third one, and probably a function of all these other issues, really, is that often then, because of all these challenges, things become too slow given the nature of high performance sport. And sometimes a more simple solution has already been developed, or the question has become redundant and the sport or the staff have moved on. So what we really wanted to do was develop a framework that would help overcome some of these challenges and put us in a better place to provide better processes to inform these high performance sports practice with data, hopefully in more efficient timescales. So it's taken lots of different forms, as you'll see if you dig into the paper itself. Um, but as we kind of narrowed it down and as we kept reflecting about the things that really fundamentally underpin the framework and what it needed to do, there was a few key things that I'll just list here and you can obviously read more about in the paper. Firstly, the key thing we wanted was that this spanned the whole data life cycle. There's lots of good papers out there that focus on specific aspects, whether that be the definition of the question in the first place, whether that be the particular methods and models that can be applied to data, or the way we visualize data. But what we wanted was a higher level perspective of kind of all of the key principles that are needed from start to finish, and then to restart that cycle in projects informed by data. And importantly as well, the key thing this is there to do is to support the athletes and ultimately to enhance their performance at the end of the day. So one of the crucial things was ensuring that we had athlete-centered design in this. And again, you can see that discussed in more detail in various sections throughout the paper. And you'll see in the framework in a moment kind of how that's represented and what other layers that brings into the framework. Another key consideration, which again is discussed, these four considerations are all discussed early on in the paper, is that it's important that we aim to inform practice through data and not drive practice through data. And this is a term we've kind of borrowed and we cite to other people in the paper, obviously. But I think it's really crucial that in sport, we have to acknowledge, like in many domains, we cannot measure everything. And there's lots of knowledge and lots of information in other sources that need to be part of this decision-making exercise. And data is only one piece of the puzzle that helps to inform those decisions. And it's not aiming to be the driver of those decisions. Related to that, then, the third consideration was the need to integrate a variety of expertise. So not only integrating expertise from coaches and practitioners in terms of that experiential knowledge that they possess, that in some aspects is ahead of the research, but also in terms of the research and the academic expertise that contributes to this. We need expertise from sports scientists, we need expertise from data scientists. And those are two very general terms as we expand on in the paper a bit more. This really has to be a collaborative exercise with a range of different expertise in order for it to be successful. And then the final fundamental consideration really was that we were ensuring validity. And actually, this framework was all about ensuring and maintaining validity. And again, it all links back to ensuring that we're doing right by the athlete and that we are collecting valid data through valid means, and that everything we do is kind of compliant with the various processes that surround this whole process. So that's a kind of very brief bit of context, and you can obviously read a lot more in the opening parts of the paper. What I'm going to do now is just briefly introduce the sort of visual and the structure of the framework itself. So I'm going to put it all up in its entirety. It is a lot to look at, first of all, which I fully appreciate. I'll then sort of strip it back and just explain the structure behind it, and then hopefully, if you're interested, you can read the paper and understand how we've pieced it together. So here it is. It's a circular representation, working sort of clockwise round from 12 o'clock. And you can see with the numbered sort of components towards the center, there's 10 different components that we feel fundamentally comprise this framework. And they're split into four stages, which are marked by the four sort of main colors that you can see around each quadrant, essentially. So the purpose, number one, the capability, number two, analysis, number three, and then translation, number four. But what I'm going to do is just sort of take that framework out of the center, first of all, just to explain the general structure and the way it should be visualized. So at the highest possible level, and this relates to our sort of fundamental considerations that I've just touched on in particular, you can obviously see the athlete at the center with the coaching staff around them. And then at a very kind of basic resolution, this is not intended to be very high resolution, but as you progress out from the center towards the periphery, you're kind of moving more from those tasks that require sports domain expertise, so where the sports scientist might lead them, towards those where greater data domain expertise is required. And again, you can see discussion in the paper of these different terms, and we try to use them loosely because there's a lot of other kind of papers that touch on this terminology and the way different roles are used in far more detail than the scope of our paper needed to get into. But essentially, components near the center are those that need more sort of sports scientist input primarily, and those towards the outside need more kind of data expertise and the different sort of data science roles contributing to them. You can also see around the outside of the framework, we kind of acknowledge the various conditions within which this operates. So the external conditions, such as the laws, the regulations, the funding, the societal expectations, some of which are relatively static, some of which are much more dynamic. And these then kind of help to work with and determine the way that the internal conditions So the policies and procedures that organizations put in place are actually kind of established. And all of that ultimately is a function of the culture of the organization itself and is kind of considered by the governance within that organization as well. So these outer layers are sort of there and they're intentionally not just kind of stage gates or points in the framework. They are there at all times. They are fundamental considerations that can and do influence all steps and all components of the framework, and that we do need to kind of interact with at various stages throughout that framework. The four high-level stages of the framework itself, you can see here, the purpose, capability, analysis, and then translation are sort of the highest level way of thinking about how we progress through the various tasks that are needed. And it does seem quite simple at a high level, and we kind of went through various iterations of this, but ultimately think this is a really simple but effective way of looking at it. So it's essentially split into two pairs of halves. If we put a vertical line through the framework, then the right-hand side is scoping and the left-hand side is implementing. And if we put a horizontal line through the framework, we've got the big picture in the top half and the details in the bottom half. So we start with scoping the big picture in stage one, then we scope the details, then we get into the collection or the extraction of data. And that's a really important consideration, that there is a lot of work that has to be done before we get to that point. The purpose and capability are fundamental tasks before we move into collecting or extracting data. And then we're implementing the details, a lot of the actual doing work with the data, and then we're implementing that knowledge hopefully back into the big picture in our kind of fourth stage there of translation. So if I now put the framework back on top of all of this, hopefully those sort of levels of viewing it now make a little bit more sense. So we've got those outer layers around it, the athlete obviously in the center. We've got tasks nearer the center requiring more sports domain expertise. So you can see the early components, number 1 and 2, the definition of the question, the identification of the constructs, being close to the center and requiring greater sort of sports science expertise to help do those effectively. And some of these things are already very well done in lots of organizations, and particularly these early parts in good, effective sports organizations, they are very good at. So we're not saying all organizations need to kind of restart and rethink all of these things. This is the whole point of looking at the whole framework, the whole life cycle of data, and including that all in our framework. And organizations hopefully can identify where they're strong and where they perhaps need to invest more resource. And obviously then there's other components that are further out towards the outside of the framework. Those are where we need greater input from those with data science knowledge. So often around the infrastructure in component number 5 there, and then some of the tasks around the data wrangling and curation and modeling in the bottom left there, the component 6 and 8. You'll notice also in that component there's a circular arrow kind of showing that iteration of often that occurs in that analysis stage. There are other arrows that you'll see on the framework. We haven't drawn sort of every possible iteration through this because it becomes a real mess. But again, we touch on that in the write-up. Okay, that's hopefully a very high-level overview of why we set about doing this framework, the fundamental principles that sort of underpinned our development of it, and then how it's structured at its various levels. Hopefully, that's given you a bit of a tempted to go in and have a read of the paper to find out a bit more about these different stages and components and the reason we've done this and how we think it can be useful for a range of different scales of sporting organisation and for different purposes within those organisations.